Today I want to talk about one of the most powerful shapers of the human being, and that is your environment, the immediate physical and human environment in which we all live. And the critical thing here is to approach this truth not from the perspective of being passive and sort of resigned to the fact that our environment is going to shape us, but if it's in fact true, which it is, and we're going to explore that together, the environment is one of the most powerful influences on who we are, then our response must be, how do we proactively shape the environment? If the environment shapes us, how do we shape the environment? And we really have to understand that on two levels. One is on a very practical, tactical, physical level, and then there's a dimension which is much more profound, and that's what I really want to explore with you. But let's start on the most basic practical level, and it's something that comes out of this week's Parsha of Ki Teitzei, where the Parsha says, if a person builds a new house, ki tivne bayit chadash, and it says that v'asita makeh legagecha, you shall put a railing, a barrier, parapet around the roof so that nobody should fall off it. V'lo tasim damim beveitecha, and do not put blood in your home. In other words, make sure that your home is a physically safe space, and it refers to a situation when people would be on the roof and living on the roof, so you would need to have a railing to prevent people from falling off. And then the Rambam, based on the sources in the Talmud, the Midrash, the Gemara, and other places, the Rambam in the laws of protection and safety and the sanctity of life, the Rambam says that this applies more broadly. It's not only in terms of a house and a roof, but it is a widely applied law which says that we need to do everything in our power to make sure the immediate physical environment in which we live is safe, whether it's on the top of a building or it's a pit, or, for example, a modern day application would be a swimming pool. The very important mitzvah to put up a fence around a swimming pool to prevent anybody falling in who can't swim, and that would pose a danger. So that this mitzvah from the Parsha says we have to do everything that we can within our power to make sure our immediate physical environment is physically safe for people to live in. And it's a very important mitzvah. It says, "V'lo tasim damim beveitecha," do not place blood on your home. In other words, the omission of doing so would hold the person who didn't place the railing, the fence, would be morally responsible for what happens. And then there is an application of this which is really fascinating. It comes actually to the very first Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, where it states there, "V'asyu siag l'Torah," you shall make a fence around the Torah. Now, it's fascinating that it uses the term a fence. It's the Mishnaic term for this makeh, the same as we'd build a physical fence to prevent a person from falling off a building or falling into a swimming pool. There is a mitzvah to create a fence around the Torah to protect a person from the moral and spiritual danger. In other words, the world in which we live is not only dangerous from a physical point of view, but there are moral and spiritual dangers. And this has two applications. The most basic application, the primary meaning of this Mishnah, refers to the mandate that the Torah gives to the rabbis, to the rabbis of the Sanhedrin, when we had those official structures, to create legislation, decrees to protect the laws of the Torah, so that a person shouldn't come to transgress the laws of the Torah. And let me give you a classic example. We all know about the prohibition of mixing milk and meat, but the Torah says you may not have milk and meat mixed together when they are cooked together. It says, "Lo tevashel gedi b'chalei v'imo," only when the meat and milk are cooked together. So strictly speaking, in terms of the laws of the Torah, you could have cold meat and cold cheese together and eat that wouldn't transgress the actual laws of the Torah. But the rabbi said, listen, in every kitchen, there is meat, there is milk. The chances of mixing together and it leading to the transgression of the mitzvah of the Torah is very great, and therefore they created a number of extra barriers and buffers so that we wouldn't transgress, and said that you can't even have them cold together, and that we even wait between milk and meat, and all of the other applications of it, that in order to protect the basic law. There are many rabbinic decrees to protect the spirit of Shabbos. So that, for example, the things that one cannot handle, handling money or pens or things that you do work with, that is also created as a barrier to protect the laws and the spirit of Shabbos, that technically you would not transgress if you did those things in terms of the Torah, but the rabbis had the mandate to protect the laws of the Torah. Another classic example of this are the laws of Yichud, where there's a prohibition between a man and a woman who are not married to have a physical relationship. So what the rabbi said in terms of the laws of Yichud, you may not even be in a room alone together, even if you're not touching and having a physical relationship, cannot be in a room alone together that nobody else has access to, because if you don't have that, you won't be able to protect the basic law. So these are all the fences that the rabbis put up around the Torah to protect the Torah, and it's fascinating that it calls it a fence, because in the same way that there's physical danger, which is what our Parsha deals with, there is a concept of moral and spiritual danger. The Tiferet Yisrael on this Mishnah, which it's very significant, think about this. This idea is so foundational to the essence of Judaism, to the essence of what the Torah wants from us, that it is one of the statements in the very, very first Mishnah of Pirkei Avot. And on the statement, the Tiferet Yisrael, one of the great commentators on Pirkei Avot, says this applies not only to the rabbis in their legislative power, to make laws for the entire society, but he says each individual must think about their own life and say, what are my weaknesses? What are the areas of my life that could lead me to transgress? How do I protect myself and to, in a way, create personal barriers and buffers to transgressions that we know that we are liable to. So a simple example would be when you hire an accountant, make sure you hire someone who has impeccable integrity, someone who's going to be pushing you to fill in your tax forms and do your business in the most ethical way, not someone who's always looking for a way of avoidance and you know that person's got ethical issues. So you put yourself in a situation that could lead to that moral danger of doing something which is unethical. And so the basic message is this: we have to proactively create the kind of life that we want by proactively shaping our environment, because it is an approach which recognizes the vulnerability of the human condition, both physical and moral. And there's a fascinating article by Rav Chaim Shmulevitz, one of the great Mussar thinkers of the 20th century from the Mira Yeshiva, and he says that the most important thing we need to do is to make sure we don't fall into a situation when we are tested. Because if we get put into a situation of being tested, who knows if we're going to succeed in that? And very often a person can be overwhelmed by temptation to do the wrong thing. And he says that's why we daven every day in our prayers. It says, Al tavienu lidei nisayon. Don't let me fall into a situation of being tested. We have to recognize how powerful the forces of the Yetzer Hara of temptation are. And our test, he says, is to make sure that proactively we don't get tested, because once we're in the test, then it's a 50-50 on a good day whether we're actually going to pass that moral test or not. Fundamentally, all of these approaches, whether it's for the physical safety or the moral or spiritual safety, these are tactical, behavioral ways of doing things. And it's something that a lot of the behavioral science today, there are many books written about this. For example, this famous book, Atomic Habits by James Clear, the classic in behavioral science, Nudge, written by Taylor and Sunstein and many more. They all talk about the idea of how small practical things that you do can catalyze the behavior that you want. So you have to think, what is success? What's the outcome I'm looking for? What are the things? So that one of their tactics is the idea of habit stacking, that if you want to do something, you link it to a habit that you're already doing, then it's a way of making sure that you do what you really want to do, because small behavioral adjustments can actually shift everything that we do. But actually, the idea of shaping the environment is much deeper and more profound, because what we've been talking about until now is the idea of shaping the environment, which is a very physical shaping of the environment. But there's something which is much deeper than that. You see, action is not just a product of the practicalities and the tactics of what happens to us on a day-to-day basis. Our actions are really a product of a culture of values and a way of thinking about the world. There's an entire cultural system, a context. And what we need to shape then is not just the physical environment, but the cultural and thought environment in which we live. How do we think about things? What's our worldview? How are the people around us? How do we create that kind of a culture? Because we don't live in a vacuum. We live in a context, and our behavior and everything that we do and our actions and the way that we live is a product of the culture and the context in which we live. And where does this insight come from? It comes from a Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, chapter 3, Mishnah 17, an amazing Mishnah. The Mishnah says, and it's a Mishnah by Rabbi Akiva. The Mishnah says that it gives a number of different things, that one thing leads to another. So it starts by saying, Schok v'kalud rosh margilim et ha'adam le'erva, that frivolity and lightheadedness and emptiness bring a person to sexual immorality. And then it says, tradition is a protection for Torah, and giving a tithe is a protection for wealth. Nadarim, vows are protection for separation, and the fence for wisdom is silence. And it keeps using the same word that we saw in the first Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, because it said in the first Mishnah, V'asu siag l'Torah, make a fence around the Torah, and it uses the same word here. Masoret siag l'Torah. Masoret siag l'osher. It's talking about this idea of a fence, but what it means it's a much deeper approach to it. In chapter 1, Mishnah 1, when it says make a fence around the Torah, it's talking about the practical, tactical way of doing it. Here it's talking about the conceptual framework, that if you get this right, everything else is going to fall into place. The only way to understand what I'm saying is to look at the examples of the Mishnah. Let's take the first example, where it says that schok, which is frivolity, mocking, a sense of not taking life seriously. The kalut rosh is also, it's frivolity, it's lightheadedness. The very opposite of these two things is a sense of seriousness and respect for life. So it says the frivolity and the emptiness, that leads to sexual immorality. Now let's try and understand why. You see, the sexual ethic within Torah comes from the idea that the physical relationship between a man and a woman must be part of something which is higher and greater than that mere physical relationship. It needs to be part of a loving, giving relationship. It needs to be part of a relationship of commitment and loyalty, and it needs to be part of the mission of family and parenthood. In other words, which is what the Torah framing it needs to be part of marriage. And all of this amounts to marriage, and actually the idea of a breached sexual ethic is when you detach the physical relationship from this context. And that means what is the mindset of that? The mindset of this kind of context of marriage is a respect for the purpose of life, a respect for the idea of the purpose, and respect for self and respect of others, the seriousness of life and the sanctity of the human body. That is all the idea of what is called by our sages here, koved rosh, the seriousness and the honor and the respect that we give to life itself, as opposed to the frivolity, the emptiness, the mocking, that which detracts from it. And so what it's saying is, if you want to create a life which is built around a sexual ethic that the Torah says is holy and it's enhancing and it gives meaning to life, well, then it needs to be part of an attitude of seriousness to life. If it is not, then all of it will fall apart. So it's about creating the right context. Next thing the Mishnah says, Masores siag l'Torah. Tradition is the fence around the Torah. In order to be able to learn Torah and access its wisdom and to truly understand its spirit, what we need to do is to understand the context of the Torah. That the context of the Torah, it's not just another book. It comes directly from Hashem, from Har Sinai. And so from Mount Sinai, and so what the commentators here say, the Rav Rabbeinu Yonah, what this refers to is all of the traditions that we received to firstly preserve the text, the written text. They explain about how we know every single letter, and it's an amazing story. If you think about every Sefer Torah around the world, and we've been scattered for thousands of years, North Africa, Eastern Europe, everywhere, we all got the same Sefer Torah, because as Jews, as Jews, we have held on to the integrity of the text as if our life depends on it, because our life does depend on it, because every single word and every single letter comes from Hashem. That's why if you're reading a Sefer Torah and they find one mistake in it, you stop reading, you put the Sefer Torah back, because that's how mistakes creep into a text. You find a mistake, so you keep reading, then you forget to fix it up, and then eventually mistakes creep into the text. It is everything, as well as the oral Torah tells us how to understand the written Torah. Without the oral Torah, we have no way of understanding the written Torah properly. And so what we have preserved through the generations is Masorah Siag LaTorah, the tradition that has been handed down from generation to generation. That is the protective fence. In other words, that is the context and the culture of the Torah, that when we approach Torah, we realize we're not just looking at another book of wisdom in the world. We are looking at the book of the creator of the universe. And we have to understand that before we can even begin to approach it. That's why before learning Torah, we say blessings of thanksgiving to Hashem, to say thank you for giving this to us. We have to understand He was the giver of the Torah. Otherwise, what we're approaching is we're just looking at it as another form of wisdom in the world, when qualitatively it's in a different category altogether. Next statement in the Mishnah, Masros Siag La'osher. Giving the tithe is a protective fence around wealth, which the commentators here, Rabbeinu Yonah and the Rav, say about this based on what our sages say. We have a tradition that we have a guarantee from Hashem that if we give the Ma'aser, we give the 10%, that will come back to us, and that God will give us a blessing of wealth. It's a special promise and guarantee that only applies in the laws of tzedakah. Otherwise, reward is in the next world. Of course, you get reward for this also in the next world. There never guarantees in this world. Tzedakah, charity, is one of the only cases that the Torah gives us this guarantee. And so that's part of what it means. And the Maharal explains, because when you bring your wealth closer to Hashem, Hashem is the source of all blessing, so more blessing comes into the world. But I would like to add to that and say as follows. If we're going with our theme of this Mishnah, that it's giving the context and the culture for a concept, if we want a context and a culture to create wealth, the best way to do that is by giving tzedakah, because tzedakah creates the mindset which allows us to create wealth in this world and allows us to have a proper relationship with money. Because when we give tzedakah, we recognize that ultimately all of it comes from Hashem. When we give tzedakah, we realize that we cannot hold on to it forever, and that the only way, paradoxically, to hold on to our money is by giving it away, because then we get the credit of a mitzvah in the world to come that is there for eternity. And it nurtures within us a spirit of abundance, of generosity of spirit, of being a giver, not a taker. All of that actually is the right and healthy approach to money, that if you want to truly be wealthy in the world, need to be a person who has this generosity of spirit, who lives with abundance, who's not trying to hold on to everything. That paradoxically brings a culture of wealth into the world. So that's the next part of the Mishnah. The next part of the Mishnah is Nadarim Siag Leprecious, that vows are a way to bring separation. What does separation mean, precious? It means living within limits and boundaries. The way to live to an optimum is not in excess. Like the Mishnah in chapter 2, Mishnah 8 talks about all of the excesses that bring destruction to a person. And we know that in the world of health and diet and exercise, if you don't eat with restraint, that brings destruction. There is restraint and boundaries, and so too, emotionally, we need to live within boundaries. Morally, we need to live within boundaries. Pleasure, it has to be seen as serving a higher end, not an end in and of itself. And so Nadarim is when we take on voluntary self-restrictions upon ourselves. What that means is we are committed to a life and a culture and a context of self-discipline and self-mastery, and that helps us to live at an optimum, at the healthiest possible way, not only from a physical point of view, but from a moral and a spiritual point of view. And then the final part of that Mishnah is that the fence for wisdom is silence. Again, if we want to access wisdom, to truly understand the world, what is the culture and the context, the values that we need to access wisdom? What it's telling you is silence. Why silence? Because silence represents humility, that we are seeking wisdom from others, that we are not the sole source of wisdom, that we will just give over all the wisdom. It's humility curiosity. We want to know what other people think. What do they truly think? Empathy, understanding where they're coming from. The ability to truly listen to a person. As the Mishnah says in chapter 4, Mishnah 1, who is a wise person? Someone halomed mikol adam, who wants to learn from all others. And so therefore, the culture and the context and the values of wisdom come from silence. And so what we've seen from all of this is that environment shapes who we are. It's the most powerful shaper. And therefore, we have to proactively shape our environment on a practical, tactical level, but also in creating the context and the culture of how we live and why we live in that way. And we have to proactively go out and do that. We are not the passive, resigned subjects to the environment. We have to go out and make our world into a better place and create the optimum environment from a practical, tactical point of view and from a culture, context, and values point of view so that we are set up for success. Thank you.